Okay, so the other day I got a comment which started off with the following sentence. You're a simulacrum of a pseudo-intellectual, academia living in hyper-reality. And after reading the full comment, which went even more purple in its prose, I couldn't help but sort of laugh at the rather poetic irony of someone employing that verbiage to call me the pseudo-intellectual one. But you know what? It got me thinking. I kept thinking to myself, am I a pseudo-intellectual? Because, you see, I always presumed that the base requirement of a pseudo-intellectual would be an ungrounded and unfounded belief that one was an intellectual in the first place. At which, based on my many videos that I've made discussing my intellectual failings, from failing my exams to failing my PhD effectively, from not being able to read to reading too slowly, etc., I always thought it was sort of pretty obvious that I think quite lowly of my intelligence, and thus, as such, I couldn't possibly be running in the label for pseudo-intellectual. But then, it kind of got me thinking, whilst the term is used quite liberally online, I don't really know what constitutes as a pseudo-intellectual, and I don't know what constitutes as an intellectual in the first place. You see, in my head, there are many layers of a scale of intelligence, as it were, which is made entirely by myself, subconsciously, with no basis in research whatsoever. I had literally developed the scale without even realising it, and it was only when I received this comment that it provoked the thought in my mind. So at the bottom of the scale, I sort of put clever, like clever people, and then a step above that, I would say, was academic, and then a step above that, I would say, would be intellectual, and then ultimate step above that was genius. Now, I've always put myself in the clever realm sort of thing. I'm like, I'm clever, I'm kind of book smartish, but nothing really exceptional, nothing more profound than that. And yet somehow, despite my openness of my shortfalls, my academic failure, and kind of my inability to spell, pronounce words, thanks to my dyslexia, all that stuff, I still gave off the impression that I considered myself intellectual, and thus, rightly so, that would make me a pseudo-intellectual, because there's a huge gap between clever and intellectual. But what makes an intellectual? And is there a difference between intellectuals and academics, or intellectuals and geniuses, and intellectuals and those who are clever? But obviously, there is a scale that we all apply subconsciously, and people do treat these words differently even though they're sort of in the same realm. So take, for example, the figure Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is an academic, and one could be like Jordan Peterson and be an academic. But one of the most common insults I see online, there's quite a few insults to be fair, but one of them is that he is a pseudo-intellectual. I've seen that used quite a lot when people discuss Jordan Peterson, particularly in critical videos. And what they mean by this is, i.e., his academic credentials, how well read he is, how many publications he has, both academically and commercially, do not constitute towards an intellectual portfolio, and thus he is a pseudo-intellectual. So if publications or academic credentials do not make one an intellectual, which I agree, what actually does? But before I get further into my self-realisation and exploration of pseudo-intellectuality, allow me to talk about a really wonderful, wholesome sponsor of today's video, which is Craftsy. I know, I get to work with Craftsy again, I'm so excited. Craftsy, if you're unfamiliar, is an online community and resource where millions of crafters, makers, DIY enthusiasts, whatever it is, you get it. They can learn anew or improve their existing creative skills. So whether you're interested in learning how to draw or sew or do yoga or cook or bake or do woodwork, Craftsy has over 2,000 exciting classes led by talented, friendly experts who will inspire you with their wisdom and passion. I wanted to learn how to do craft, mixed media, as it were, when it comes to painting and ink and things like that. And I was inspired to do that after I went through a few of the other programs on there about sketching, and I found Mark Taro Holmes's class all about how you use mixed media in sketches, like ink and paint and watercolour. It's really fascinating. And it's not just video classes. Members have access to Craftsy's live streaming tutorials where expert instructors share their tips and answer questions directly to the audience live in front of everyone. So if you want to find the joy of making something and just getting off your phone and endless doom scrolling on social media, then I have an awesome deal for you. The first 1,000 of you who click the link in the video description down below will get, hear this, a full year of premium membership to Craftsy for only $1.49. Exactly, which is only valid to new members only, but incredible opportunity here. So thank you Craftsy for sponsoring today's video. Check my link in the description box down below. And now let's get back into it. And this is my rabbit hole of, really? I actually don't know what would make an intellectual. So In my peripheral Googling for just discussions on this topic, I came across 2 videos on the topic that came out last year. So the first one I came across was one by a channel called Unsolicited Advice, which, my God, I've never come across this channel before, and it's amazing. I loved it. I'm like recommending it as if no one has subscribed to this channel. He has 500,000 people following him. Never heard of him before. Great, it's absolutely great. And we'll go more into his video later. And then by chance, his video was actually responding to another video by another creator called Dr. Anna, which was also very fascinating, and I subscribed to both people immediately because, lots of exciting content to consume. So interestingly, both are obviously talking about pseudo-intellectualism, but both took very different approaches to the same topic. Unsolicited Advice is evidently a philosophy-first channel, and he formulated a classification system of what makes an intellectual. Now, obviously, please go watch his video for the full portrayal. I'm doing a great disservice in my primitive summary here of the section that I want to talk about, but in exploring the branch of virtual epistemology, leaning on a book that he referenced and recommended called The Inquiring Mind by Jason, Bear's argument could be construed to argue that an intellectual is one who practices the following. They use the term ideal inquirer, so I'm going to stick to that there, but I'm sort of using the ideal inquirer and the intellectual interchangeably. So the ideal inquirer is one who would dispense reliable information. Their pursuit of learning is for virtuous reasons, i.e. it's not with an agenda or a preconceived conclusion. The ideal inquirer would go into inquiry aware of their own biases and open to different conclusions that they may come across. The ideal inquirer should also be thorough in their investigations and pay attention to detail. They should be consistent with their intellectual rigour and has the ability to decouple their unconscious and conscious biases when exploring a topic, thus applying the same degree of intellectual rigour to their own reading of the information as much as they do the information itself. Obviously go watch the whole video, it goes far deeper than that. That's a bit I wanted to sort of highlight here. Now, Dr. Anna's video explains the red flags of a pseudo-intellectual, which she compares against those that she calls shady intellectuals, because she distinguishes these two different things. So the pseudo-intellectual, Dr. Anna argues, is marked by characteristics such as secrecy and avoidance regarding their qualifications, either by being dishonest about having any at all, or inflating them, or bending the parameters of their expertise. The second one, she says, is cosplaying the intellectual, though she didn't go into the area I thought she would when she used this term. You see, I expected Dr. Anna to talk about cosplaying intellectualism as someone who looks and sounds basically like me, has a lot of books behind them, sounds like an idiot with a stupid accent and dresses in a rather old school way. But for Dr. Anna, the idea of cosplaying intellectualism referred to those who uploaded sections of faux podcasts that they were on, or these fake questions that they're being applied with, like, "Ooh, you're an expert, here's a question," and they would answer it naturally as if it hadn't been constructed. Additionally, these clips are usually deep and meaningful, and they act like they've been cut out of bigger sections, but in reality they've sort of been orchestrated to look like that. They are in of their entirety just that section. There is no further information out there or a different speech. Thus, for Dr. Anna, the cosplaying of a pseudo-intellectual relies more on presenting oneself as an authority figure on a subject, rather than how they physically appear. Though I would argue sometimes the aesthetics could be counted into that section, but she's talking more about presenting oneself as an authority rather than actually how they aesthetically look. One can look like a pseudo-intellectual and wear a black t-shirt and jeans. Additionally, Dr. Anna said that not citing their sources is also a marker of a pseudo-intellectual, but also as a more weird gatekeepery experience. So she gave an example of someone citing her own video that she had made without actually citing her, and they used it as a phrase of, "Oh, I learned this technique from a video and I had to share it," but they didn't share where they learned that information. And again, that's sort of the opposite of what we're taught in academia. So surely intellectuals should be proud of showcasing where they learned certain ideas from, because it demonstrates how well read they are, or how intrigued they are on a topic, how much they've listened to or watched, and what content they've consumed. The more content you consume in an intellectual manner, surely that's something to be proud of, because it demonstrates that they took the time to learn something, and that demonstrates learnedness. But pseudo-intellectuals are scared to suggest that they are dependent on external sources when they share knowledge, as they'd rather give off an authorial vibe. Which then goes back to the authorial stance Dr. Anna talked about. She also suggests that pseudo-intellectuals speak in absolutes, often offering unregulated coaching, which I suppose is very much in her science and psychology area of research. I don't think it really affects the humanities section that much, but obviously because Dr. Anna is in the field of psychology, she's probably more sensitive to that idea. So interestingly enough, both Unsolicited Advice and Dr. Anna spoke about the pseudo-intellectuals' appeal to authority. And I sat there thinking about it, and these videos are great. I'm not criticising these videos at all, but I think there was a bit missed out because technically that's actually still really hard to define when one is watching something. The appeal to authority is rather difficult for anyone to dissect. Let me explain. So there are obviously many videos on YouTube which speak often in absolutes when they are delivering facts, from science videos to history videos that I've made in the past. And technically, even these two videos that I discussed, both videos at points did speak in absolutes. I mean, when defining the characteristics of an ideal inquirer, or even how to identify a pseudo-intellectual, is an absolutism. And also, they both make authorial statements that define a person by absolute categories. And these two people are academics and intellectuals, there's no doubting that. But technically, neither of them specialise in pseudo-intellectualism, because no one does. But technically, one could argue with these angles is that they are speaking on a subject as pseudo-intellectuals, because both at times employ two of these tactics, absolutes and authority on the subject, when neither are experts in pseudo-intellectualism, which of course is a ludicrous argument in of itself, but it shows how technically some of the boundaries are quite weak of the concept, regardless of how much philosophy or psychology is employed when discussing the topic of being the pseudo-intellectual. As such, even after watching these videos, I found myself feeling a little bit more confused by the topic, because whilst both these videos were incredibly insightful and amazing, and it really opened my eyes to discussions on intellectualism, there were so many holes still. And technically a lot of the arguments could be mirrored back in on themselves, which then sort of made the point moot. So let's give an example. One can technically criticise someone's appeal to authority and say, well, you have no right to speak on that subject without being an expert, and I can tell that you're an expert based on how you're speaking. But then both of these videos failed to define what constitutes as an expert, because if having a degree does not make one an expert or an authority on a subject, what does? And then how can we, the listener, determine accurately whether or not the person is a pseudo-intellectual on a subject, or someone who's just actually quite well learned in the subject but may have given a bad paper or a speech on the matter, may be better scripted and not good in a podcast setting? I don't know. I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt here, because technically those are realities. I have seen people give really bad conference papers, but they're not pseudo-intellectuals, and there were flaws in their holes. Again, they weren't being a pseudo-intellectual, they just hadn't read about that topic. And again, I would say formal education is not a qualifier here, because I feel like there's a lot of intellectuals out there who don't have any formal education or higher degrees at all. And I feel like technically it would be quite snobbish to call someone a pseudo-intellectual if they speak on a subject without having a degree in higher education on the subject, because it's becoming a more and more elitist privilege every day. So that's going to be outcast for many people, and I hate the idea of people gatekeeping intellectualism based on degrees. Another thing I noticed is that most discussions on pseudo-intellectualism come from judging people online, or on television, or interviews, or books. And it's never really about a face-to-face individual. And to be honest, I came to the conclusion, after all of this, that I find the defining of a pseudo-intellectual relies on a rather superhuman ability to accurately judge how much intellectual rigour one has put into their work behind the scenes. Which, how is anyone supposed to do? Isn't that sort of intellectually dishonest to draw conclusions, especially if you also are not an expert in the field yourself? Because what if some of these people that are being labelled as pseudo-intellectuals did apply a lot of intellectual rigour, but the outcome they give is basically as good as they have, and that's all they can produce in a new field? For example, Dr. Anna points out that she herself used to use a lot of absolutist language when she was an undergraduate because she was inexperienced. Now, would it have been fair to label Dr. Anna at that time in her life a pseudo-intellectual? Or would it have been far more kind and fairer to say she's just someone on a learning path? And that's why I think there's dangers in applying, absolutism terms to new people going to a topic, and they can be young and they can be old. It's, again, we don't know. Now, I have used the term pseudo-intellectual before, and the time that sticks in my head the most was actually in a real life context when I referred to this event. I didn't call the person this personally, but I came away feeling that was an experience of a pseudo-intellectual. But I used to work in a bookshop, and there was one of my colleagues who literally scoffed when a customer bought a particular book. And the colleague literally went, I just can't believe you've never read that before. Now, with all due respect, this book was incredibly niche as well. It's not like it was, a really common book like Harry Potter. It was incredibly niche texts that ironically that this bookseller had actually made a display on, and then they were mocking people for buying the books that they had created a display for. They had pitched for these books to be put on display, and they mocked customers when they bought them. And I was only there for one occasion. Goodness knows how many people they did. And from this example, when I thought, oh, that was such a pseudo-intellectual thing to do, I have thus actually got a different definition of what the pseudo-intellectual is. And to me, I've always regarded the pseudo-intellectual as someone who intentionally alienates others from the subject of interest. So whether that is through concealing their resources, whether that's through mocking someone's attempts at learning, or from using bloated language or impenetrable sentences. And also, people who have a willingness to judge others based on their limited perceptions of another person without knowing the person entirely. Again, because I think judging how clever someone is or how much hard work they put in is sort of a pseudo-intellectual endeavour, because you never really know. And there I find almost the defining of people of pseudo-intellectualism by these terms is almost in of itself a pseudo-intellectual endeavour, because it's not an academic, rigorous exploration of something. You're defining something based on just preconceived notions and subjective opinions. And I know what people are thinking, and here's my personal take. I wouldn't even use the term pseudo-intellectuals for those who spout unscientific nonsense like flat earth theory or Atlantis exists, for example, because with all due respect, I believe those theories are not grounded in anything other than paranoia and suspicion, not intellectual or academic exploration at all. So it seems so far removed from intellectualism that even being classified as pseudo-intellectualism seems a bit extreme to me. I also would distinguish pseudo-intellectualism from bad and dishonest academia, so such as the works of Graham Hancock, who cherry picks and falsifies data to suit his agenda. Now, with all due respect, I just find that practice unethical, and it's just plain old lying. And I wouldn't even call that pseudo-intellectualism, because the latter term, pseudo-intellectualism, completely ignores the scale of danger and dishonesty of what they're doing. Referring to that kind of person as any form is intellectual, pseudo or not, seems to sort of miss the point. They are dangerous, they are lying, and they're profiting from their lies. That's not anything to do with pseudo-intellectualism. That's entirely lying to the public, in the same way anyone who would profit from anti-vax information and wrote books on that would be profiting from a complete lie for their own agenda, and usually just shield some kind of like alternative medicine. It's not pseudo-intellectualism, it's just scamming. In all honesty, it's just bad academia, bad practice, and just scamming. However, going back to the video, I mean, what I loved about unsolicited advice video in particular, I love both videos, but what I loved about this video is that it also inspired my conclusion. It gave me a whole new perspective on how I should always be conscientious about my attempts. Like, I always want to do that, I always practice that, but again, just going with my research going forward, it gave me a whole new perspective of how I'm approaching my research. Ironically, one of my weaknesses in my offline academia, which I've been criticised for in the past, and rightly so, is that I do come in with an emotional bias a lot of the times when I'm researching a topic, because I tend to, talk about really serious topics like violent misogyny and hate crimes, and because I talk about quite serious topics, it's hard for me to detach myself from how I feel about those things. It's very hard to write about those topics when you're passionate about them. But this video really inspired me to think, actually, yes, I can see where my supervisors get frustrated when they can see where I'm coming from, rather than I'm talking about something objectively. And I think that's what I took away from these videos, is not how to define a pseudo-intellectual to point fingers, because I think the very endeavour of labeling someone like that is almost like is as fruitless as diagnosing people on the internet that you've never met. And I think the labeling of someone as a pseudo-intellectual in of itself employs some bad academic practices and bad practices of intellectualism in general that I think almost negates the whole endeavour. I find it would be a deeply hypocritical thing to do, because it relies on a lot of assumptions being made about someone's intellectual rigour and how hard they work and things like that. We can be dubious of certain people, but I find the labelling and identifying of pseudo-intellectual almost a hypocritical practice. However, this is where my conclusion comes in, where I think it is a really beneficial label, is in self-reflection. Because I think understanding what makes a pseudo-intellectual is more actually a benefit to ourselves, to make sure and hold ourselves accountable when we are engaging with anything, whatever topic that may be. And I think it should be less about pointing the finger at people going, they're a pseudo-intellectual and they're a pseudo-intellectual, and rather asking ourselves if we're the pseudo-intellectual and asking if we are living up to good intellectual practices and keeping ourselves in check rather than pointing the finger at other people, if that makes sense. I understand when people look at me, I can understand why I've been called a pseudo-intellectual by odd comments in the past, because it's mainly for superficial reasons. Look at me. It's usually my taste of fashion, my obsessive love of books, and my horrible accents. But I make sure that when I am presenting the information I found, I do attempt sometimes to put on a professional tone, and that can come across as authoritative, and I see why. So that's something that I wish to address and amend, because I don't want to be an authority. I was just trying to be professional online, but I can see where I could be perceived as speaking as a professional on something, which would grate on people. And I think watching these 2 videos really helped me see that. I thought, actually, I can address that too. I can see where, when people look at my videos and may see that and don't know as a whole, I can hold myself accountable, and I can see and identify what makes a pseudo-intellectual and hold myself accountable, and while still pursuing the dream that maybe one day I can progress from being clever to being academic, because that's my real goal, is to get from that stage to that stage, and that's all I want. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it. This is a rabbit hole that I went down. I need to write out my thoughts because it was actually really interesting. That's probably the first time I've ever not gone to a book. This is primarily, I was like, I'm just going to look, and I was like, oh, someone's done a video on this. Let's see what they said. And then I had so many thoughts from these 2 videos. So my apologies, I'm not using lots of resources in this video. It's just more my thoughts on going back and forth thinking, actually, I have so many ideas to add to this. I miss those days back in the day in YouTube when you could do a video reply. So I hope these 2 creators did not mind. I've subscribed to both of you. I think you're fantastic. So I hope you don't mind. I talked about these 2 videos. Thank you as always to my patrons for making this video possible. I really, truly appreciate it. And just a reminder, I have a Substack and a podcast and another channel. All of that is linked down below. As always, thank you so much for being here, and I hope you are happy and healthy. And remember, books save lives. So keep reading.